Hi there, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the FORRT community, I would like to thank you and thank the ProjectTier for the opportunity to be here and present our work. We learned immensely from the presentations of the 2021 Spring Seminar, as we'll learn from the ones that will come. Thank you so much for putting it all together. What a great way to share knowledge on how to best educate our students. We prepare a series of small presentations hoping to provide educators with the resources needed to integrate open scholarship into their educational pipeline. We're kindly invited to talk a little bit about FORRT, but also how we can build a community from open scholarship pedagogy. So today's presentation is about providing a holistic view on integrating open scholarship into your teaching. In this series of short presentations, it will be our pleasure to introduce you why we created FORRT, our framework, and our community. I'll be presenting that. Leticia from Maastricht University in the Netherlands will talk about bridging open scholarship into higher education, but from an institutional perspective, and talk about the challenges and solutions that resulted from a hackathon we did about 2-3 months ago at the OER conference organized by COS. Then you see me again, and we're trying to answer the question, how does the teaching of open scholarship affect positively students? Do they stand to gain? So we're going to try to answer that. Next, Sam Parsons from Oxford University, the other co-founder of FORRT, will talk about FORRT's educational resources that are already ready for you to use. And they are located at the website, and hopefully that can be can sponsor that integration of open reproducible research training into your educational pipeline. Then we'll receive a testimonial by Katia Oliveira, who is at York University and managed to implement for the first time the open scholarship in their curriculum. So we will hear about her testimonial as well. All right, so how did it all begin? Although the scientific community has known the importance of research transparency for hundreds of years, open scholarship practices have received renewed attention in the last decade. The Center for Open Science, for example, has as a mission increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility research. The researchers therein have proposed 3 guiding principles to steer science towards what we call scientific utopia. Scientific utopia has 3 pillars. The first is open scientific communication. The second is restructure incentives to promote better scientific practices and truth over publishability of findings. And the third is crowdsourcing science to promote large-scale collaboration and accelerate scientific progress. Back in 2008, when FORRT was founded, this renewed attention had already led to progress in many respects. In this slide, you see a collection of open scholarship initiatives, all doing their part to achieve this utopia. As you can see, there are both bottom-up and top-down initiatives, which is very heartening. However, teaching of open and reproducible scholarship has received comparatively little attention. This means that although some researchers have embraced open scholarship practices in their own labs, for example, there appears to be much less systemic incorporation of these practices when it comes to education. As a result, it's still very common that graduates and undergraduates finish their studies without ever hearing about open scholarship. All right, so FORRT was created in part to make the argument that there is a 4th pillar to scientific utopia. We suggest this 4th pillar, or this 4th guiding principle, is to familiarize students, the future consumers and practitioners of science, with the intricacies of open scholarship, integrity, and transparency. So in an effort to support the integration of open scholarship, very broadly construed, and the open scholarship movement into higher education, we proposed and created FORRT. FORRT's main goal is to build, together with educators, a path towards incremental adoption of principal teaching and mentoring practices.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Leticia. I'm a member of FORRT, and today I would like to briefly talk to you about bringing open scholarship into higher education the challenges that we often encounter when we are trying to do so, and what are possible solutions that we can think about together in order to some extent, try to circumvent these issues. So, as I'm sure we all know, cultural shifts in academic practices require both top down and grassroots or individual initiatives. And at the moment, much of the responsibility for implementing open scholarship practices into our own teaching, research, and mentoring, they lie on educators and researchers themselves. And I think we can all agree that there are very little top-down incentives, for example, coming from institutions and organizations that can foster a more widespread adoption of open scholarship practices into higher education. So, given this current scenario, FORRT is currently trying to conduct a project that aims at identifying the main obstacles to the implementation of top-down open scholarship practices, for example, a more widespread adoption across our departments and institutions, and also in defining potential ways in which we can try to overcome these obstacles. So with this goal in mind, a hackathon was conducted earlier this year by Julie Strand and Flavio Azevedo at the COS Open Education Resources Conference. And what the participants tried to do there were basically identify these main obstacles and also resources that are out there or potential solutions that we can use when we ourselves encounter these issues in our day-to-day work. So if you're interested in more detail in the output of this hackathon, you can find everything at this OSF repository in this link that in this slide. And here in this presentation, I will basically outline the main issues that were identified and later on the solutions and resources that were also identified. And for the purposes of this presentation, I will organize these main obstacles into three main clusters. So the first cluster regards concerns about open scholarship in general. So because this is a new movement, there are still lots of uncertainty out there. So for example, we may think that open scholarship in general seems to be a lot of regulation for something like research, which should be a creative process, or that it's still unsure what are the benefits of open scholarship in the long term and if they will actually pan out. Or, for example, while open scholarship might be great for quantitative research, it might be less clear how it applies to qualitative research, and likewise, how it may apply to different disciplines and fields. So it might be that we are in a field in which we question if this is really something for us. A second set of concerns and obstacles I'm sure we can all agree with is the lack of proper incentives. So engaging in open scholarship practices, of course, requires time, that we dedicate time. For example, to pre-register our studies, to make sure that our data and code is shareable, but also usable and understandable. And there are concerns that this is too much time for very little payout, or, for example, uncertainty about whether your efforts will be valued when we are applying for jobs or for promotions. And overall, there might also be some reluctance into seeing cultural change if we do not see how this cultural change may bring direct benefits to us. Lastly, there is this third cluster of obstacles identified, which regard a difficulty to implement this top-down and more generalizable initiatives. So, for example, we might think that it's hard to change policies because adoption of open scholarship practices may work for some, but not others, depending on the field that you are, for example. Or that there is lots of variability in the possibility and ability to adopt open scholarship across areas, even within the same department. And of course, all institutions or organizations deal with limited resources, And there might be times in which we may think that it's better to invest these resources into teaching content rather than in teaching open scholarship, for example. So, as I said previously, participants at this hackathon not only identified these main concerns and main challenges into bringing open scholarship into higher education, but also they try to outline what are resources and solutions for it, which I will present now for each of the clusters that I have mentioned before. So regarding the concerns about open scholarship in general, one thing that we can try to do is to engage in constructive conversations with our colleagues and share our own experiences with open scholarship. So here you can see a picture of this blog post on the 10 arguments against open science that we can easily counter. And as perfectly outlined in this blog post, some of the criticisms about open scholarship are reasonable, and we can identify and we can agree with our colleagues on them. But we can also share that the movement is still growing, is still ongoing, and we are all learning as it goes. And we can also make sure to try to tell other people how we, in our own practices, are trying to our best capacity to make sure that our research is open, or that our teaching materials are open, or how we are trying to teach students and mentees about open scholarship practices. Some of the resistance to join the open scholarship movement might also stem for fear of being, for example, scooped if you pre-register your studies, or fear that some people might find errors in your code or in your data. And this other blog post that I'm sharing here, it's very nice in showing how these fears and objections often don't stand up to scrutiny. Now, some other possibilities is that we may think or consider organizing workshops within our own departments and institutions. And this is a very nice way to actually expose more people to the principles of open scholarship, and to initiate lots of people into what this actually is. Another thing that we can do is to encourage our students and colleagues, and do it ourselves as well, to join a local reproducibility T group. Now, concerning the second cluster identified, which is the lack of proper incentives, there's this very nice paper that you can find here on how open science helps researchers succeed. And one thing that we can think of is trying to highlight to others what are the benefits of open scholarship. And of course, there are benefits to the individuals adopting open scholarship practices. For example, as outlined in this paper, which does a literature review on what is out there about the benefits of open research. Open research is often associated with increases in citations, media attention, job opportunities, and funding, but the benefits don't stop out there. So there are also benefits for the institutions in general. And if we are trying to pitch and open scholarship practices to, for example, our own institutions, we can also highlight this shift in social norms. So as journals and funding bodies, they call for more open research. And as the social norm moves more towards open scholarship practices, failing to keep up may mean lower research rankings for our own institutions, less desirable prospects for students, and also less funding. In addition, we can also try to advocate within our own institutions for recognition of open data, preprints, and open teaching materials to be considered as valid scientific output. And depending on the positions that we are within our departments and institutions, we can try to advocate for open practices to be considered in hiring, tenure, and promotion criteria. These ideas are also taken from this paper, which you can see here, this preprint, Nudging Open Science, which is a very nice read and shows how you can try to nudge open science into the varying levels of academia, for example, in our own research, but also in our departments, faculties, journals, funding bodies, and etc. Finally, concerning the third cluster of identified in this hackathon, which concerns the difficulty to implement these more generalizable initiatives, we can share examples of good practices of open research across disciplines. And a very good way to start is this document that is being put together by UKRN, which has lots of resources and lots of examples of good practice and resources across disciplines. So it's a very nice way to start by seeing what is out there for your own discipline regarding open scholarship. So we know that changes towards a more widespread adoption of open scholarship will require time. And in the meantime, while I hope that these tips and materials are somewhat useful, for us, in the meantime, we can also start by making sure that our teaching and mentoring encompasses some principles of open scholarship.
All right, now I'll present an ongoing FORRT project that shifts the focus away from researchers and institutions to students. All right, so as everybody probably know, Baker 2016 published a major paper in Nature trying to lift the lid on reproducibility. And one of its findings is that a lot of scientists seem to agree that teaching and mentoring plays a major role in the process of improving research practices. And we can see here on the right that better mentoring and supervision and teaching and more time for these two things are very likely to contribute towards improved practices. So for us at FORRT, the driving question is for this project is how does the teaching and mentoring through open and reproducible scholarship changes or affect students towards their attitudes towards science, their role in these, how do they see academia and the scientific processes in general. So surely the scientific community has taken steps to reflect a widespread awareness of improved practices, and this is known as the credibility revolution, which includes higher standards for what constitutes evidence, pre-registration, direct replication, transparency, openness, and we at FORRT like to think also diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, and while there are still issues with the widespread adoption of these practices by academics, the integration of these new and improved practices has lagged behind when it comes to teaching. And we think that this is to the detriment of students and the quality of higher education in general. So in an effort to raise awareness of the educational benefits of these better practices to students, we reviewed the literature on the topic and teased out why academics should integrate open and reproducible principles into their teaching and mentoring. And in this process, we provide some recommendations. So the project goal is more about teasing out arguments and the evidence that we found didactically to motivate and encourage that integration into higher education curriculum. So while the project is still ongoing, we hope that the preliminary findings that we have is useful to your teaching and to motivate that integration. All right, so from here on out, we're going to talk a little bit about how the topic of replication or credibility revolution affects students. We're also going to touch upon how using pre-registration protocols as a pedagogical tool can help, how to integrate direct replication, not necessarily direct, but replication also in general, but most evidence relates to direct replications into your educational pipeline, what does exposure to peer review process relates to one's view of the scientific community, what happens when you receive training on questionable research practices, and a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how this sort of intersects with it all. So what happens when students are exposed or taught the topics of replication, the replication crisis, or better yet, the credibility revolution? So in 2018, Chopik and al. In their Society for Teaching Psychology paper showed that students perceived psychology as a more scientific discipline when exposed to these concepts. And we think that when uh, in this case, it's about psychology, but probably it reflects other fields as well. And students also considered psychology to be closer to the natural or hard sciences. And students had a greater appreciation for study design and the elements that increase reproducibility. Students also trusted individual study less, but had a better understanding of what reproducible research looks like. So positive results all around. Um, this tracks with our knowledge when it comes to how psychologists are perceived by people. So for example, Wingen and all showed that replicability increased public trust in psychology. And also Eberso and all in 2016 showed that psychologists were more trusted when they were more open, transparent, and reproducible, right? Now, when it comes to another educational tool that can be incorporated into your pedagogical tool set, pre-registrations, 2014, Funder and all published a paper, a very interesting paper, giving recommendations on how to use pre-registration. And one of them had to do with defining the measure, which items go in it, con trait, pro trait, as well as the sample characteristics, student or types of samples, snowball sampling, for example, convenience, national representation, and think about how the sample characteristics help generalize the found findings, the finding results to the larger population, and also help students or discourage them on mining their data in search for post hoc significant effect, and not labeling into exploratory versus confirmatory data analysis. So there were two expected outcomes. One is to sort of enshrine on students the idea of telling the whole story, and learn about the importance of meta-scientific, so thinking about research um, uh, more broadly, the processes that we use to acquire knowledge, as well as meta-analytic thinking in the sense of how do we put together several other studies, or um, how do we put together data into a meta-analysis, for example. So Morley and Colling-Yageman reinforced that idea and say that students that were exposed to pre-registration also found it more likely that psychology is a science, and that by making students think about their predictions and where effects would go, and thinking about direction, it fostered positive emotions such as interest and anticipation before data collection. And moreover, I think the most important takeaway of this paper is that by including these topics into their teaching through registration in this case, students learn that science is more of a incremental development and a cumulative process. So Blinko and Butchert in 2019 also found that pre-registration can be a very helpful tool, and especially when planning studies ahead of time, and also had the interesting effect of making students interested in no findings. So to understand that it's not only positive findings that or significant findings that are of interest. And Cornwall also speaks about how pre-registration can help the communication between mentees and mentors, as well as expectations, and may alleviate problems with the statistical anxiety and other learning issues, and not to mention helping students with their analytical thinking. So Nola and Colombo found, they have a very interesting article, but they found that not only the use of pre-registration increased a student's critical skills, but also it teaches them two very important concepts within the meta-scientific literature. One is harking, so hypothesis after results are known, hypothesizing, and p-hacking, which is just when you use data or a specific analysis to achieve statistical significance. So you can incorporate these all together and talk about them, and they find it very helpful. And lastly, we think, based on Boughton and al., one of the good aspects of pre-registration, and this is very much argued in favor of in the literature of direct replication, as we will see in a moment, that students can help with the creativity and inject new hypotheses and help improve the replication and help extend it. When it comes to direct replications and its use as a pedagogical tool to not only integrate open and reproducible research training into your educational pipeline, but also teaching students the processes of science, there is an excerpt by Hawkins and al. In 2018 that we find it useful to motivate our literature search as well, even if we focus more on the benefits to the students. Despite the enthusiasm for this idea, the idea of replications, the papers from 2015 and 16, there were limited data beyond anecdotal reports and individual projects to suggest that there have been pedagogical benefits to the use of replications that would suggest we need to implement this on a larger scale. Nowadays is a little bit different. There are many projects, in particular undergraduate studies, but back then that wasn't the case. So Frank and Saxe in 2012 elicited at least two reasons why we might be able to use replication as a pedagogical tool, and that its implementation might be useful to everyone involved, to the extent that there is no need for a novel question. And this is particularly important because we don't bias students towards positive psychology or positive any other science. And also, there is no need to delve into the intricacies of study design to answer the question. So we just need to follow a rule and a protocol, ideally via a pre-registration, in which we follow the steps of previous published research. And there is an advantage to the community. There's two advantages to the community, to the extent that if this is a novel article, for example, the community doesn't know how replicable it is yet, so it doesn't know how reliable its results are. And it's likely that because it's novel, it deals with a contemporary topic that might be of interest to the students as well, that might not be so into the weeds into the literature. So when it comes to replications, perhaps one of the best sources of information and inspiration is the Collaborative Replication and Education Project. You pronounce it as GRAPE, like the fruit. And in 2019, Jordan Loggy argued that students benefit by participating in these scientific collaborations on an international scale, not only because you're participating in these collaborations, but also because you have firsthand experience with scientific dissemination. You can present your work on a conference, for example, but most importantly, they have a sense of achieving and advancing science, and they do so without the need and for actually knowing how to do the procedural aspect of a scientific paper, right? So this is a big advantage. Grahed and al. Also speaks to something close to this and says that whenever students and researchers join forces, it can help break the glass ceiling of academia, hopefully encouraging students to think of themselves not only as students of science, but contributors, and in the future see themselves perhaps as part of it. So, in its principles to the education leads to larger sample sizes and increases the likelihood of publication. So students are also more motivated in this sense to create and help produce this knowledge and also engage in replication debates and its issues. So it leads to higher engagement. Jekyll and all, as part of the Hagen Cumulative Science Project, which is a really cool project for undergraduates, they aim at two goals. So first is to teach students how to conduct the entire research process of replication while using the highest standards available, but also to contribute to cumulative science and increasing the number of direct replication. So in a way, this is following up a little bit from Everett and Earp. And so they find that students benefit by following the structured protocol and by making actual contributions to science motivates them in not only following the process, but understanding its several steps. Importantly, Crow and all and 7 Easy Steps to Open Science, another really interesting and filled with good information paper, states that, well, because not all under and graduate students will end up in academia or will end up being researchers, the value of teaching replication crisis might not be super obvious to everybody, or at least not immediately obvious. And however, similar to Tropic and all, the goal is more to teach students about replications, about giving them the tools to identify what is reproducible research, also to appreciate the importance of openness and scientific rigor. And altogether, the idea is to train students to be good consumers of science after they leave the education pipeline or higher ed. To also integrate these principles into your education pipeline is to talk about QRPs, questionable research practices. So Krishna and Peter 2018 found that students' attitudes towards QRPs was best predicted by practice of QRPs in their thesis. So this is very interesting, and perhaps even more interesting is the found correlation between students' attitudes towards QRPs and the perceived supervisor attitudes towards QRPs, which was of 41.41. And this means that students may perceive to be QRPs to be normative and therefore perpetuate the cycle. Even more interesting is research by Sacco and Brown, 2019, that designed a 1 hour, so very low commitment training. And what they did was that they measured QRP attitudes 1 week before their training of 1 hour, 1 week after, and 2 months after their training. And their results show quite convincingly that students were able to not only identify QRPs, but also deem QRPs as less ethical even 2 months after the training.
Hi everyone, it's nice to be representing FORRT and in particular the FORRT community that's really behind the amazing resources that I'll be describing shortly. It's always nice to represent these amazing people, and as I believe Flavia will come to next, we hope that you'll join us too. So I'll focus on 4 of the outputs that FORRT's generated and the community is still working on in some cases, as well as ways that you can get involved yourself. What I want to highlight is not only the kind of the power of the community building these resources and developing them. I want to highlight that part of the purpose of these resources is to kind of move away from the many useful and valuable resources that are kind of revolve around teaching yourself about open scholarship and methodological reform kind of practices, and really focus down on the development, curation, production of resources that educators can more readily use within their own teaching. The purpose being, as always within FORRT, to try and reduce the burden that's placed on educators. So instead of, for example, spending an awful long time teaching oneself to be able to understand the intricacies of a practice, to then be able to employ it, to be able to utilize instead materials that are already available, and kind of learn from other examples out there, or be able to build on resources, educational resources that are already available, and we're hoping to curate again and produce within FORRT. So I'll start with what's possibly the longest running project that we have, at least that's kind of been up and running on the website. And this is our summaries of open scholarship literature. The idea behind this is that educators can kind of quickly scan, get a sense of the literature around open scholarship, and kind of help guide the selection of resources to use in class, whether that's papers, and so on. Now, each summary includes, as in this example, kind of main takeaway points, the abstract, links to the resource itself, and a few other kind of useful bits and pieces. Again, we kind of hope that this helps instructors sort of not feel the pressure, I guess, of becoming an expert in the nuance within a specific practice, and be able to drill down into a subset of the literature that's most relevant, and hopefully save time and effort. This is now being developed into lesson plans and kind of discussion plans, in which the paper that the summary is based on can also kind of have discussion points, kind of smaller lesson plans around that, again, in order to just provide that additional context that that educators can use in order to kind of make the most, I guess, of these resources, these papers within their teaching. Next, I'll highlight the educators corner. The idea behind this platform is to have a place for educators to share their pedagogies, to share their experiences, and in particular things that were challenging around teaching and incorporating openness in its widest form within their teaching. So two examples that we have up here. The first being using this transparency checklist guideline not only as a kind of research tool, but as an educational tool within one's own supervision of students. And then also our first post, in fact, was around addressing representation in undergraduate psych classes. This is also an opportunity I'll take to highlight that when we talk about open scholarship, we really mean open in the broadest sense possible. So, for example, in the summaries that I talked about on the previous slide, we also include a number of summaries on important papers in relating to diversity, equity, and inclusivity, in order to really kind of capture openness to mean open, as opposed to specifically drilling into specific instance of methodological reform, for example. So these aspects are very important to us at FORRT. Okay. Now, building on this, we have the FORRT pedagogies. The purpose behind the FORRT pedagogies is to provide, you guessed it, the pedagogy, the kind of background information, the lessons learned, the information that educators or other educators would find useful in reusing and adapting educational materials that are already out there. So, for example, Professor Julia Strand had already shared her amazing Psychology's Credibility Revolution course materials, lectures, slides, assignments. Julia had already shared these openly, which is amazing. And Julia was willing to work with us and kind of explicate her pedagogy around this course that she'd developed, delivered for several years at this point, and really provide background information that we other educators who may wish to extract sections of that course, to reuse elements, to kind of benefit from Professor Strand's experience within delivering this course. It was very generous. If any of you have open teaching materials or kind of thoughts on the pedagogy, we definitely encourage you to talk to us about highlighting those in the FORRT pedagogies or the Educators Corner within FORRT as well. And finally, I'll highlight the glossary for open scholarship terms, our work in progress currently, to which you can find our working document at the tiny URL that I've linked there. And you're also extremely welcome to join the project. We have a number of terms that are still within need of kind of further approval, further comments, and for all we know, there may be important terms that are missing, so we value contributions. Now, the purpose of the glossary is to provide, we hope, a helpful entry point into discussing open scholarship, again in its broadest forms. There are a number of terms in there relating to diversity, equity, inclusivity within scholarship. So it's not only methodological reform. Okay, so we hope that it will be a useful entry point, particularly as a number of terms are used either interchangeably or differentially between and within subject areas. For example, the classic 2015 mass replication project from the Open Science Collaboration, I believe, titled something like assessing the reproducibility of science, that using many people's definition, one might call replicability, given that they conducted replication studies, and often computational reproducibility defines using the same data, the same code to produce the same results. But I digress. In the example here, open peer review is a great example that without having a definition that's kind of easily accessible, it can be really easy to get lost amongst the discussions, because the definitions that people use are often interchangeable and could indicate a number of different practices. As highlighted here, open peer review has been used to refer to any or all of the above practices. And we think this is a really important thing that educators can provide their students in order to help them navigate these discussions kind of more quickly and more efficiently during their own experience. If you're interested in getting involved in any of these projects, please reach out. I'm sure that Flavia will share our invitation materials shortly. I'd love to have you on board. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Katja Oliveira and I am a third year PhD student at the University of York. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my journey to open science, as well as how we brought open science teaching to our department. So as a starting point, I'm going to go over some of the motivations for me to engage a little bit more with open science. And to do so, I'll start with my PhD. So these may be quite shared experiences where we are often left with the need or a hypothesis to make sure that our data is being as comprehensive as we wanted it to be, but we don't always have enough time and resources. So it would be useful to have data being shared more often, so we could test hypotheses without needing to collect data. This is also the case when doing replication work, where methods are often not clear, materials are often not shared, and so we tend to feel the need to contact authors, or at least find ways of simulating the materials to get as close as possible to what had been previously done, without being 100% sure that we are doing exactly the same things. This is also the case for meta-analysis, where there's often insufficient information and data, and so we tend to have to contact authors who are very busy and sometimes don't have the data in accessible formats, or it has already been destroyed, so it takes a long time to go through these processes. So based on my experience, I started to developing this need that was very self-serving for open science. And that's when I started to engage more with the reproducibility, and then later became a co-organizer alongside Anna and Jamie. So reproducibility consists in having these periodical meetings in a group of people that share their interest in open science, and we tend to read a paper related to open science and then have a little discussion about it. So based on these meetings, we then started noticing there were commonalities in where we were lacking some knowledge. And so we used this information to organize some workshops alongside Dr. Angela De Bruin, who is the head of the Open Science Interest Group. And so this group is quite a successful one, in that we have good attendance for our meetings, but also we managed to get good attendance for the workshops and good feedback. Unfortunately, we all felt that we were still not managing to reach everyone we wanted to reach, namely those that are not really interested in open science. And that's around the same time I joined FORRT. And for those of you who don't know, FORRT is a pedagogical infrastructure designed to recognize and support the teaching and mentoring of open science practices. And if you have ever visited FORRT's website, you will notice how many resources have already been produced and are still being produced till this point. And some of them are FORRT's manuscript, many corrected resources on various topics related to open science, as well as great examples of teaching, namely by Dr. Julia Strand, but many other people. But to me personally, there were many influential cases, but I'll focus on the most influential ones. So the first one that led me to be interested in FORRT was obviously the ethos, where by aiming to make open science teaching more accessible, both to the students and to the lecturers, it made it possible and easier to turn it into a reality. And by making this change of having teaching of open science in every university, we would potentially take a lot of the tone out of the individual and more into what the university as a whole wants the standard of open science to be, or science to be. We also have a great community and meetings where people from a vast array of areas come together to share their love for open science and aim to make open science teaching more accessible and easier for those interested in taking it into practice. But an additional aspect that is quite interesting and is it reflects something that is very different from academia in many ways, is the fact that authorship is very clear, where it doesn't really matter how much or how little or where your strengths lie, as you will always be recognized for the efforts that you have done. And whilst it is a vast community of people, you can always build on each other's strengths, where if you are not that keen in writing, but you are very keen to review, that would be completely fine, or the other way around. So it's a community that builds on everyone's strength, and that is quite different from many other areas. And finally, one of the resources that made quite an impact on me was the manuscript and the created resources. So the manuscript is a fantastic resource if you are interested in bringing open science to your department, as it makes a clear case as to what are the benefits of open science to the department and the students, as well as gives you a practical way of achieving that goal. It is not just focusing on it being a good thing in terms of a theoretical basis, but then give you the resources so that you can put it into practice. So that was what we aimed to do in our department. So we went about it in quite a long journey, but I'll just go through the steps, and I am very keen to share the resources if you are interested in them. So as a starting point, we ran a workshop about open science in general and pre-registration in particular. And this was quite well attended, and first years that engaged with this project said that they would start engaging with the open science practices. Some of them are even wishing to do registered reports during their PhD. So it was quite a successful workshop. And then I brought up to the open science research group that it would make sense to start aiming to get open science teaching to be done in the department. And whilst everyone agreed, we were still not entirely sure how to go about it. So that's when Jamie and Angela and I started to think about practical ways of achieving this goal. And one of the things that we thought would be a good starting point was to run a questionnaire to determine whether it wasn't just a need of the open science research group, as we are obviously interested in open science, but to make sure that it was a wider need from ECRs in our department. So that's what we've done. We ran a questionnaire that was adapted from the Swinburne Open Science Survey, available on the OSF on this link. And this question now that we run is just a shorter version with some additional questions targeted at our aim. That was to gather knowledge about the open science practices in the department, to identify potential barriers, as well as determining what the sources are of knowledge of open science, and determining whether they think the open science should be taught as part of the curriculum. So for our sample, we had 20 PhD students and 3 postdoctoral researchers, and most of the responses, most of the respondents indicated that they are aware of open science, with only 8.7% indicated they are unaware. But out of all these people, only 47.8% of the respondents indicated that they have some experience with open science practices. So it's quite an indication that is quite good that 50% of the respondents are interested in. It's still quite an insufficient number in our view. So the most commonly barriers indicated by the respondents to engage in open science were lack of training, lack of time to learn open science, and lack of time to engage, as well as lack of expertise to engage in open science practices. So we then ask, what are the suggestions? What could we do to make sure that we can overcome these barriers? And more time and training for open science was one of the most mentioned, as well as a more incentivized structure for adopting open science practices, as well as more guidance from the department, both in having more examples of researchers that are doing so, and having more centralized information about the steps that one needs to take to engage in open science, as well as more funding and longer contracts. And one of the things that we aim to tackle in the future, these change in attitudes, both from funders and the academic staff, as well as bringing the training courses directly to people in higher positions in terms of the academic ladder. So then we asked questions that were very directed to the aim of this questionnaire, namely whether they thought we should be teaching open science practices as part of the curriculum, to which 90.9% of the respondents said yes, with 2 responding maybe. And later we asked whether the respondents thought that they would have benefited from an introduction to open science at the start of their PhD, to which 81.8% responded yes, 9.1 responded no, and 9.1 responded maybe. So based on the results, we interpret this as there being a clear indication for the need for open science to be taught as part of the curriculum. So we thought we were left with sharing this information with those graduate school board. So that's when we decided to write a letter to the graduate school board with the aims of demonstrating this need to the department. So we wanted to do this in a convincing way, both sharing that there was a need from ECRs for open science to be taught as part of the curriculum, but also it would be beneficial for the department to do so. So we showed clear evidence of the benefits of open science, namely by showing that, for example, the articles with the preprint have more citations than those who do not. But see FORRT manuscript, where they showcase both for the students and for the wider science, what would be, and society, what would be the benefits. So it would be a great starting point to read FORRT manuscript, as well as provide we also provided examples of universities that had already implemented open science training as part of the curriculum. And again, FORRT Pedagogy is where they give fantastic examples, sometimes with the syllabus and even the courses available, which you can use as a starting point for your own curriculum. And then we presented the results of the questionnaire and the attendance of the workshop, which would make sense in terms of making it very clear that there's a need, not only from the wider population of ECRs, but those currently at York. So we submitted the letter, and a few weeks later we got an approval as a workshop that would be mandatory for PhDs to attend in the first half of in the first term of the first year as a PhD. So this is a great news for us, obviously, but we wouldn't want to stop here. We think that it would be nice to have it more integrated in the curriculum, maybe as a research part of a research methods module, and potentially then add it to teaching to undergraduates and postgraduate teaching courses. But also we also aim to get more senior staff involved with open science practices, but these are aims that we think will take a little bit more time to achieve. So I would like to finish by thanking Anna, Jamie, and Angela, without whom I wouldn't be able to have done anything. They were crucial throughout this entire project, especially Dr. Angela, who kept articulating with the staff and the graduate school board. But also I really want to thank those at FORRT because they have been a wonderful community, very supportive in getting this to the state that we got it to be now. But especially to Flavio, who has been a wonderful mentor and has definitely increased my self-esteem in terms of pushing for open science, my confidence. So I wouldn't be able to have achieved this without any of these people that I am thanking today. So if you want access to the resources, feel free to ask me via email or by contacting me on Twitter. And thank you so much. And I would definitely recommend to anyone that is interested in doing something similar to start by looking at FORRT's resources in their website. Thank you.
We hope that we could provide some food for thought in how to further bring open scholarship to teaching, its challenges and benefits. If you're interested in learning more about FORRT, please make sure to visit our webpage. And if you'd like to join our community, you're more than welcome to do so by joining our Slack channel. All information should be on our website. And with that, folks, have a great day. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for sticking with us.